let's have an analogy. When you are studying human anatomy, you can look at the human body in a variety of ways, all of which are legitimate and have their purposes. See, for instance, you can examine just the skeletal system of the body, or the nervous system, or the digestive system. We can approach the body in many different ways, depending on what we want to know at that particular time, and which part we want to focus on. So by way of analogy, we can approach the interpretation of art in the same way. We can look at one view or another, or of multiple views at once. And none of those ways is the wrong way to look at the human body. Also, none of those ways are the wrong way to look at art. They're just different ways for different purposes. Now, this actually has a name in the arts. It's called criticism. And we think of criticism as like, I don't like those shoes. But it doesn't necessarily mean negative. The word criticism here means examining, looking closely at, analyzing. So in humanities, this is called criticism. Often you'll hear it called literary criticism or critical theory. It usually has the word critical or critique or criticism in it somewhere, but you hear it called different things. But if this method first became widely known through the study of literature, so you often hear it called literary criticism or even lit crit, because that's fun to say. But it's all the same thing: literary theory, criticism, critique, literary critique, artistic critique. All of these things are a way of applying certain lenses to art to study and understand it better. Like the different lenses through which people study the human body, the circulatory system, the skeletal system, etc. Now, there are some known critical theories in the arts, ways of looking at arts that put a certain lens on to examine that art at that particular time. Here are some common ones. Cultural criticism is one. That's where you look at how did the culture that was going on at the time affect the making of this art. What do we see about the characters and the situations in the art that reflect the values and assumptions at the time? By assumptions, I mean things that people assume are true about the world or about other people or about other places or about their own bodies. Or it could be an assumption about anything, good or bad. But the point is things that you just believe without really thinking about them. So you look at what are the assumptions of the culture at the time. Did they work themselves into the writing or the movie or the painting? In what way did they? What can we learn from this? That's a wide open question on purpose. Biographical criticism is like what was going on in the individual writer or painter or movie maker's life at the time when they created this thing. And did their own personal life affect the creation somehow? Are the characters portrayed in such a way that is because of the writer or the movie maker and what is going on in their life at the time, which they're reacting to in their writing? We can't know that. Remember, we're not committing the intentional fallacy. It's just a way of thinking about it and looking at it. There's psychoanalytic criticism, which is where you use psychology. Like you go, why do these characters behave this way? What's the psychology behind their actions? What's the psychology behind the interactions between people in this movie or this book? What's the psychology that went into the way a religious figure is portrayed in this painting? You know, what was going on in that person's psychology that would make them do that? And then, of course, what's going on in my psychology and my reaction to it? All that's tied up in psychoanalytic criticism, which is fun because you could say you're a psychoanalytic critic. There's feminist criticism or feminist theory. This is looking at a work to see how are women portrayed, for instance, in the work. What assumptions did the writer seem to have about women at the time when it was written? And how do the female characters in the story or the painting or whatever, how do they interact? And what can we learn by that? What is implied? What are the assumptions? What does the writer or the painter clearly think about women? Well, how about society's view of women at the time? Did that enter itself into the art? A Marxist reading or a Marxist critique is looking at the people in the story or the situations and asking, who are the laborers? Who are the ruling class? Are there middle class people or rich people? How do they interact? How is money treated in the story? What's the sort of theory of money that you see in this story? There's always assumptions about money and how it should work. So a lot you can look at it from that perspective when it comes to money and class and economy. So you can see there's a lot of different ways, and each one of these ways, what you're doing is sort of kind of pushing everything out of the way for a second and just focusing on that aspect of the art just to see what you can learn. Let's try this with good country people. So, for instance, let's talk about Joy Holga. Now, let's talk about some factors about her. She was disabled. She had a heart condition. She had poor eyesight. She had a wooden leg, a prosthetic. She was a woman at a time when the expectations for women were very strict and limited. And there was no way for her to go make money or work in a factory or what have you, because she was limited by her location and by her choices that society allowed her, especially considering her disabilities. She was stuck. Now add to that her superiority complex and her reaction to the dominant religious ideas of the time, and this sort of explains her name change to a, quote, ugly name. A lot of people, when they read this text, they say that this was a feminist move on her part. She's establishing, she says, accept me for who I am, where I am. I'm this. Deal with it or not. She didn't care to fit into roles. Now, she was being defiant and striking out in one of the only ways she could. But notice the privilege of being able to say, screw the expectations. I mean, she's not fabulously wealthy, Holga isn't, but she's in a position where people can take care of her or help take care of her. Think of those two daughters who are mentioned in the story but never actually entered the action, Caramay and Glenise. And they're talked about a lot. And one of the things that's talked about is who they're going to marry and how they're going to marry them. Because at the time, women didn't have a lot of options. Most women didn't. A lot of women, especially poorer women or more rural women, the idea was, who am I going to marry? Because that's how you get out of certain situations and start your own life, is by marrying. Well, Joy Holga wasn't interested in marrying, and she couldn't go out and work at the time. You just wouldn't be allowed. Thankfully, that's changed. We make ways for people to work, to enter the workplace, even with disabilities, as it should be. But back then, that wasn't the case. You were just very limited, and you add that her femaleness, and well, there are a lot of limitations. All of what I did right there is critique, like I'm talking about, using good country people as our sort of the thing we're examining. So notice when I talked about her being disabled, there's a branch of criticism called critical disabilities theory. And you'll hear these a lot of times talked about in terms of theory. I'll say that a lot. This is I'm looking at the text through this lens, and I'm going to theorize about something based on that. So for instance, I theorized that at the time in society, her disabilities limited her choices. It reminds me on Mad Men, if you haven't seen that show. It takes place in the 60s, and a guy gets his foot run over in the office with a lawnmower. It's a long story. And he was an up-and-coming executive. But they just, after the incident, matter of fact, they talk about how his career was over. He was ready to take on the corporate world, but because he hurt his foot, they were like, well, he's done. It was sort of just accepted at the time. And so if you do critical disabilities theory, you can analyze that episode of Mad Men and talk about how the cultural assumptions were such at the time that having a disability meant something different than what it means now. I talked about all her choices as a woman and the other young ladies in the story and their choices and their limitations. That's a feminist reading of the text. There was no way to make money, I mentioned. Like for her to make money, she couldn't go to a factory or something because of her situation. The other young ladies who were looking for a marriage partner to secure their financial situation. We talked about how Holga is stuck. And with her superiority complex and her reaction to the dominant religious ideas at the time, which she was hostile toward, all of this is psychoanalytic criticism. This is me saying, what's going on with Holga's psychology in the story? All these characters have psychological aspects to them and choices they make that come from their subconscious and their psychology. So sometimes people will write papers like in grad school or in upper levels of college, and they'll write papers where they write about a feminist reading of this story. And they'll talk about the issues with women at the time and how they're portrayed in the story and what we learn from that and what it tells us about the author's ideas about women. And just you might have any theory that you could write a paper around just by looking at the women in the story or the views about women or the situations involving women.